I take the opportunity to welcome you all on behalf of the CPB to this annual lecture. CPB, the Netherlands Agency of Economic Policy Making, is organizing these lectures annually. It's a great pleasure to see you all here in The Hague and in this beautiful glazen zaal. The CPB Lecture is an annual recurring event where we invite internationally renowned scholars to share their insights on a wide range of economic policy issues. And this year's lecture is special as it is part of a series of events we organize at the CPB. We had academic workshops yesterday and this morning. Now we have this public event, and on Thursday we will organize together with the SER, the Sociaal-Economische Raad, an event where policymakers, advisors and academics will meet. Indeed, productivity is a very current topic with abundant attention, not in the least, of course, because we all know that productivity growth is dwindling, coming down slowly just when we need it the most because our society is aging. Yet, while there is full agreement on the importance of productivity growth, there's much less agreement on how to boost productivity growth in the near future. There's a wide range of policy proposals, ranging from building human capital, investing in infrastructure, deregulation, industrial policy, innovation policies. Many policy areas are connected to this productivity conundrum, but actually we have not a very good idea about which recipes actually have the best effect. Now, in order to be able to distinguish between these different solutions to the productivity problem, of course, we need to know first what is actually causing the productivity slowdown. And this is where economists come in and can be handy for policymakers. This year's Nobel Prize went, amongst others, to Akcigit and Howitt, who theorized about the so-called process of creative destruction. Now, this creative destruction process is a process where through the arrival of new and better products and firms, they are growing, taking market shares from firms who are less innovative and less productive. So this creative destruction process is at the heart of our economic growth process, and it has two sides. It has this creative side, so new firms making new products, new services available to us, but it also has a destructive side. That means that some firms are losing market share or even exiting the market. Now, this destruction part is not very favorable with policymakers for a good reason, but both sides are important actually to have an economy running because firms can hoard labor and can hoard capital and make it more difficult for newer firms actually to increase their market share. If they exit the market, they free resources, workers, capital, but also things like land and last but not least, access to electricity, for example, which is a major issue nowadays for startup firms in the Netherlands. So, creative destruction is the engine behind our welfare growth. We know the engine is not working as well as it used to be, and the question is, what can policy do about it? Now, a key contribution of the Akcigit and Howitt models actually is that they inspired researchers to connect theoretical growth models with abundant microdata sets. And we are very fortunate today to have in our midst one of the leading scholars in this field who is taking the Akcigit and Howitt framework to the next level. And this is Professor Ufuk Akcigit, sitting here in front, professor at the University of Chicago and director of the Global Center for Economic Growth. Professor Akcigit has been at the forefront of the combination of rigorous theory with new data sets, not just for the US, but he is initiating research activities throughout the world. And today is with us, and he's going to show us, based on his collaborative work, focusing in particular on the role of talents and the allocation of talents in the economy. And throughout this lecture, he will draw upon insights from his studies in Germany, the US, and Italy, amongst others. The planning of this afternoon is as follows. Professor Ufuk Akcigit will start. He will take about 45 minutes for his lecture. Then we will have Yvonne Adema from Program Leader Macroeconomics at the CPB, and she will present some of the recent research the CPB has done on the process of creative destruction in the Netherlands. And afterwards, we're very happy to have Michiel Boots, who is Director General at the Ministry of Economic Affairs, and he will share with us some of his policy views on this process of creative destruction. No doubt you will have questions which arise during the presentations. I'm just asking you to hold that question, make a mental note of it, and we'll have ample opportunity to discuss your questions and suggestions, but we'll only do it after the presentations when all the three presenters have been seated here up front. So, but now please let's welcome Professor Ufuk Akcigit.
Thank you very much, Marcel, for this fantastic introduction. It's a great honor to be here. Today, I will be talking about productivity, but of course, productivity is, even though, we know productivity is important, it's hard to pinpoint what productivity is. It's an abstract concept, and it's not like machinery or labor where we can count. And that's why, the productivity aspect of the discussion is typically not the most favorite thing, both from a policy-making point of view and also for studying. So that's why I think, even though, the economics as a profession is really a quite an old profession, our understanding on the productivity side, as Marcel also mentioned, is quite limited. But there has been massive revolution on the microdata front, on the theory front, and I think it's very important to create this important dialogue between economic theory and microdata so that we can go after this invisible ghost and put some shape on it and try to make it look like nicer and more attractive. So with that in mind, I would like to start my presentation. But before I go into the details, of course, when it comes to typically talking about policymaking, productivity, or economic growth, we usually, it's tempting to think that there's a magic bullet. And whenever we pass that law or whenever we implement that policy, things will get unleashed, and it never gets unleashed. And partly because, when we think about an economy, and if an economy slows down, I usually like to think of it like a car with 4 tires. And if multiple tires are broken, just fixing one of them won't cut it, right? So that's why I think it's really important to first understand how this car looks like, how many tires there are, how many broken tires there are, and then we should start approaching this jointly. So before I go into details, I would like to first put a framework on the table so that we can discuss through that framework. So this is my framework, okay? So in this framework, the way, I want to think is an economy is not just, bunch of firms investing in R&D and then, creating some sales and global markets. There are also individuals inside those firms. Some of them are managing the firms, some of them are owning the firms, and some of them are coming up with those creative technologies inside those firms. So that's why I think it's really important to take into account both the human side of things and also the firm side of things. So that's why the way I would like to think about this is, every year there's a new generation of young people that are being born. For the sake of this discussion, let's say the ones in green are the most talented ones, then less talented, least talented. And through some mechanisms, we decide to educate a subset of them. And yes, we do select to educate a subset of them through our, policy choices. because typically not everybody gets the same education, which means that either through a centralized entrance exam or maybe by sending people to schools in their own neighborhood, maybe we are really bringing family socioeconomic backgrounds to the picture, right? So that's why, for whatever the mechanism is, we may or may not give equal access to education, and as a result, a subgroup of them goes to technical education, especially when it starts from primary school, middle school, high school, university, and master's, PhD. It's like this spaceship getting thinner and thinner and thinner, basically. So we have a fewer and fewer and fewer group of people that are going all the way through all these trainings. And as a society, we spend most resources on that subgroup, but how do we select those most technical people in the society who are becoming effectively the economic elites in the society? Right, so then whatever happens to those people, probably we are losing some of the talents along the way, so that's why there are these crosses on some of them. Then, depending on the market conditions, they might decide to stay in the country or they might decide to leave. And the brain drain is exactly driven by the fact that there aren't necessarily a lot of demand for PhDs. In many countries, families or friends would say, why would you do a PhD? Why would you do that to yourself, right? So, and even the parents are discouraging their children from getting a PhD degree because typically the salaries are low in those countries. And when the salaries are low, everything gets trickled down, right? Also the prestige in the society is effectively determined, blah, blah. So everything starts with the compensation. But how is the compensation determined? Well, it's Econ 101, supply and demand. So yes, we have these talents that we are educating and pumping them into the labor market, but unless there is demand, the price for them won't go up. So as a result, those people will leave the country. Then the question is, how do we generate the demand for these talented people, technical people? Well, by simply having dynamic businesses. And that's exactly where business dynamism comes into play. The left-hand side is looking at the industry structure. There are entrants, there are incumbents. Depending on how incentives are set in an economy, an economy can be dominated by SOEs, for instance. That's one extreme. Another extreme is the markets can be SOEs, state-owned enterprises, or it can have a lot of young entrepreneurs. As it was mentioned, through creative destruction. There might be a lot of turnover in the economy. The best ones are coming in, and the bad ones are eliminated. We might have also a very dynamic one. So it depends on the industry structure. And then, we are creating some value added. And as a society, starting from talents, we close the loop. Now, what does it mean to have a slow economy? The slow economy means that in my world, in my imagination, if we think of this as a pipe, the water at the end of this pipe is coming out weak. Okay, so the pipe is blocked somewhere, maybe at one place or maybe in multiple places. So that's why thinking that just one single bullet will unblock the whole pipeline is a bit hard to imagine, right? Typically, when we look at the microdata, at the end of the day, when you go to a doctor, the doctor does a very detailed MRI scan, asks for the blood samples. But economy is like a body, right, with many cells and many organs, interacting together. We have to do the same thing. If we are doctors, or if we are pretending to be doctors as economists, and we are trying to find the solutions in problems in an economy, we have to do the MRI scan. So how are we going to do it? We have to look at the blood samples, or we have to look at the vital signs. And the vital signs are exactly what we observe in microdata. So that's exactly what we try to do currently in the literature, by simply trying to understand the macro problems by looking at microdata. Okay, so that's why what I would like to do today is share with you some of those findings that I think would be relevant for today's conversation. And I don't want to just look at one side of the equation. One side of the equation is industry, yes, the firms, but the other side is also the talent allocation. And I believe, and I strongly believe, that talent allocation is at least as important as firm dynamism, business dynamism. So just to summarize what I tried to describe, So productive turnover drives efficiency on the firm side, and merit-based social mobility fuels talent allocation. So as long as we allow the most talented people to rise up in the society, then that's great. But many, due to many different reasons, it could be due to discrimination, it could be, maybe, families, socioeconomic backgrounds might play a role, gender might play a role, people's ethnicity plays a role in many countries. So for whatever reason, even these most obvious arguments don't hold in the data, and this jumps at you whenever you look at the microdata. This jumps at you. Indeed, we've conducted. We wrote a report with the World Bank. It was the World Development Report 2024, and it was exactly focusing on the middle income trap, which is the typical problems that a middle income economy faces. And there you see repeatedly that these issues, even though they are obvious, are repeatedly problematic. And a second source that I'm showing you here is that recently we published a book with John Van Reenen from LSE, which is a collection of fantastic articles related to the economics of creative destruction, where we are approaching this problem, from very different angles, and which I highly recommend looking at these chapters. So now let me go into the details a little bit more, and let's start with a success story. Of course, when it comes to giving a success story example, it would be a crime not to talk about South Korea, and so that's why in this graph you see the South Korean example. And here it shows you the growth performance of South Korea, and it decomposes the growth into capital, growth coming from capital, growth coming from labor, and growth coming from total factor productivity. And what's really remarkable is that especially when Korea managed to grow really fast, a majority of it came from efficiency improvement. Okay, Korea not only invested more in capital, but it also improved its efficiency. And I think another important part of this graph is that, I like basketball, I like NBA, and Michael Jordan is, I'm from Chicago, so of course Michael Jordan is one of my favorite players. But what was really special about him is that when he jumped, he was able to stay in the air for a long time, okay? So I think what's really the secret sauce here is also for countries to generate this sustainable long-term productivity growth, and that's typically not happening. And Yvonne will talk more after me also for the case of Netherlands. Unfortunately, we are seeing that this sustained hanging in the air type of thing is unfortunately not happening very much. So this is the Netherlands case. Unfortunately, we see a lot of red bars pointing also the negative side. Okay, so when we look at the Netherlands economy, we see that 25% of the times there's a negative growth, and some of these negative growth on productivity has been severely negative, basically. So that's why I think it's really important to dig deeper, and Yvonne will talk more about the Netherlands case. Now let's try to unpack this productivity issue. So when we talk about productivity, it's effective, if we are forming an economy, the productivity is how we are producing collectively, right? If this room is, CPB economy, then, our productivity is whatever we are producing collectively, but effectively, it's just the sum of our individual productivities multiplied by our market share, because that's how we are producing the aggregate output. So if I don't produce anything, then I do not contribute anything. So my share in the sum is zero. If somebody is producing 100%, that person accounts for the entire economy. But since, in reality, it's these smaller shares, the aggregate productivity is just the weighted sums of individual productivities. Now, we can have two different scenarios. In one case, the left graph, let's say there's really a heterogeneity, big heterogeneity in productivity. Some people are very productive and some people are less productive. It's just a fact of life. You know, I wish everybody had super high productivity, but that doesn't happen. And you know, the firms are also very heterogeneous. Now, we know that for the sake of this argument, that some of us are really, really productive and some of us are really, really, really not productive, okay? Now, what we can do is we can say, well, all the resources will be distributed equally. I don't care about who is more productive and who is not productive. I will give exactly the same equal resources. Then we are on the left side. But then you can do the math very easily, right? So, you know, some of us are less productive, some of us are more productive. It's just the average of us determines the productivity because everybody has the same share. Now, the right graph says, well, let's do the following thought experiment. Let's say our markets are really efficient and we manage to somehow, through the help of the invisible hand, we are able to reallocate resources from less productive. We take away from less productive and give it to more productive firms. Same productivity levels for everybody. It's just that we are playing around with the market shares. By making productive people or productive firms obtain a larger market share just for the same productivity distribution, now overall productivity will be higher. And that's exactly why not only the aggregate spending that matters, but also the composition of the spending that matters. And that's why the title of my talk was "More is not necessarily better." Because, you know, we are fixated too much on how much we are spending in things, including R&D, but unless we pay attention to the composition of it, even if we spend more, we might not get as much in return. Okay, so that's why, you know, how are we going to make sure that resources are getting reallocated more and more towards more efficient firms? Well, let's look at the data a little bit more closely. So, you know, let's look at these two economies. So, you know, just for the sake of this argument, to me, the right graph looks like a supermarket economy. The left graph is more like a planned economy where, you know, everything is just equally distributed. Basically, we have a bunch of large firms and that's it. So planned economy, let's go to the extreme, very competitive market economy, let's say. So how can we test this in the data? That's what I refer to the revolution on the microdata front. Now that we have all these, you know, digital tools that we can use, we can go back and digitize historical records, and that's exactly what we did with Javi and co-authors, where now, given that there are these super extreme economies, we can go and study these super extreme economies by looking at their microdata. We will compare centrally planned economies to more market economies, and there will be a spectrum, okay? So when I talk about centrally planned economies, this is Soviet Russia, East Germany, will compare to West Germany and the US. Now, I will ask a very simple question. What is the relationship between firm growth and productivity shock? So, you know the instrument accordion, right? So I guess it's the same word. So, you know, accordion gives you a nice music when it expands and contracts, right? Without expanding and contracting, you don't get the nice music. But economies are just like that. Firms should expand and shrink so that the overall productivity improves, which means that sometimes I will have my spark, I will come up with some very productive ideas. In that case, I should be able to hire more workers through the liquid labor markets. And sometimes, you know, maybe, you know, the CEO or the top managers in my company will resign, or, you know, he or she will pass away, and now I won't be able to maintain the same dynamism. In that case, I have to shrink so that my resources gets reallocated towards more productive firms. How can we test this? We can just correlate firm growth, how many workers they are hiring, to the productivity shock, meaning that if productivity goes up or not. If beta is 0, it means that firms are not reacting to productivity shock. So we are not able to reallocate resources towards more productive part of the economy. But if beta is really, really high, then it means that whenever somebody becomes more productive, the right side of the room is more productive, we take resources from the left side and give it to the right side. Let's look at the empirical counterparts. East Germany is reported, but it's effectively 0. Soviet Russia is also super close to zero, and probably that's not a surprise because the resources were not distributed in planned economies according to the productivity. There was something completely different in planned economies. Let's look at the US. US is the other extreme. The correlation between firm growth and productivity shock is extremely tight. I think the most interesting country in this graph is West Germany. Because this is coming from historical records, but today it's exactly the same picture. It's just persistent. How markets operate is completely persistent. So, when we, probably during the Q&A, we will also talk about Europe in general, but it's just a different ecosystem, okay? With the regulations, with, how people approach risk-taking, blah, blah. It's just a different ecosystem. Markets are much tighter, labor markets are more rigid. As a result, firms who are experiencing positive productivity shock are not able to hire as much. And just look at this graph. This graph already summarizes the difference. If the responsiveness to a positive productivity shock is half of the US, productivity or resource misallocation will be double of the US. Because effectively, at the micro level, things are not being reallocated towards more efficient firms. Let's ask the same question. Normally, there has to be a tight relationship between productivity and firm size. There's an obsession about having large firms. Typically, especially when you go to developing countries, policymakers think that the main problem is that there are no large firms, so that's why they do everything to make the firms larger. I think size itself is not important. Indeed, it can even be dangerous. If the growth is happening thanks to productivity, that's perfect. But if growth is happening not due to productivity, but because they are, having some good communication with policymakers and they are getting sweet deal in the background, then large is a terrible thing, right? Size in that case is a very problematic thing. Indeed, it will just generate capture, it will generate market concentration, it will kill competition. So that's why an important question is, whenever we look at the micro data, we need to look at the relationship between productivity and size. Let's do that. This graph is showing the relationship between productivity and size. Surprise, surprise. The highest correlation is in the US. West Germany is half of it. Why? Because firms didn't react to productivity shock as much as the US firms did. As a result, when it comes to size-productivity relationship, the correlation is half of the US level. Okay, so that's why I think, the first takeaway that I want to, summarize from these findings is that it's not a, it's not a rocket science when it comes to really, we don't need to get puzzled when we see big misallocation at the aggregate level. The aggregates are just reflecting what's happening at the micro level. So that's why we need to look at these problems at the micro level by looking at the micro data. So how are we going to generate this resource allocation in the best possible way? Well, the theory of creative destruction is informing us on this. Normally, there has to be a balance between creation, preservation, and destruction. Marcel said that the destruction part is typically not very favorable by the policymakers. I couldn't agree more. But in the data, this is stressing out many people, policymakers or anybody gets very stressed about destruction. So that's why we make sure that business don't shut down, even if they are not productive. So as a result, typically what we observe is on the left side. Okay, there's much more preservation after creation happens. The preservation side is much bigger and the destruction side is very small. If we don't make space, how are we going to have new entrants into the economy? And that's exactly what we are observing repeatedly in many, many economies. Now, I think, there is a lot of discussion on, of course, making the economies grow by making it more, create more jobs. Of course, job creation is something that we all care about, but there are different ways of generating job growth. One thing, it's not difficult, by the way, to create jobs, right? Just, tax, increase the tax rate, give subsidies to firms. say that, I'm going to pay 95% of the salaries of the workers, firms will be very happy and they will hire many, many workers. But, is this really how we want to go? Is this really how we want to generate jobs? And I want to differentiate between induced job creation and organic job creation. And willingly or consciously or unconsciously, this induced job growth is repeatedly implemented, either through subsidies or sometimes through punishments. And let me show you an example of the punishments case. So I think, we talked about the German case, and I find the German case quite interesting because it's such a strong economy normally, but there are massive discrepancies between different regions of Germany. And I think, the current discrepancy and, the gap between East and West in Germany has its historical roots. And I want to show you some interesting results from early 90s. So what happened in early 90s? Of course, the wall came down in Berlin, and then there were 15,000 companies that were supposed to be privatized. To be able to privatize them, the privatization agency Treuhand was founded. But what happened is that initially people got really stressed because, from 0% unemployment, just in a very short period of time, unemployment went up to 15, 20%. Underemployment was almost 40%. People were demonstrating on the street. On April 1st, 1991, the head of the privatization agency got assassinated, and he died. So what happened? Of course, people were already, demonstrating on the street. These type of things were also happening related to privatization. Both the agents got also privatized, and I can tell you lots of stories about this if you're interested, but I don't want to take too much of your time related to these historical details. But for this conversation, I want to draw your attention to this graph. This is how they run the privatization. Initially, when they were trying to sell the companies, they were doing due diligence and asking for the fair price for each of these entities. And these are the red bars, okay? The more solid dark bars are showing the contracts that were asking not necessarily a price, but a labor commitment. So they were saying that, if I'm going to sell this company to you, I don't care about the price that you're going to pay, but I want you to keep 10,000 workers in your company. But the companies are super unproductive, right? They are super unproductive. What happened to the accordion story? So this is exactly throwing it away, right? Because the concerns were very, very different. So as a result, what happened is that these type of policies were very focused on the short-term job creation, and it was using stick, not using incentive, but it was using stick. If you don't hire 10,000 people, I'm going to impose a fine for each worker that you didn't hire. Okay, so as a result, this was forcing people to hire more. Yes, did they create more jobs? Of course they create more jobs. So look at this labor commitment. So the x-axis here is showing the firm's initial size to the target size. Okay, if the ratio is less than 1, it means that unless they hire more people, they have to pay a fine. If the ratio is, close to 1, then they are exactly at the target. If they are above 1, then they are already above the target and they can shrink if they want to. And that's exactly what we observe. If they had a binding labor commitment, if they had a binding contract, they hired 30% more workers on average. Fantastic job creation. But this was not an organic job creation. This was induced job creation at the time. And whenever those contract periods were ending, the job creation, the red dashed line, was coming down. Okay? So these type of policies, either through subsidies or through stick, is just creating policy edict firms. As soon as the policy is pulled back, maybe in the short run it looks good for the numbers, but it's not healthy for the long term of the economy. In the long term, the main effective thing is to generate organic growth. So how are we going to do it? By improving productivity, technology, and innovation. That takes a longer time, but that's the sustainable one. That makes the economy stay, keep more jobs in the long term. So that's why, I think one of the main problems that, related to privatization was that the policymakers were, of course, very much stressed about the 1994 elections. They had to rush the privatization. A lot of the, bad policies were implemented, and the German economy still pays the cost. Indeed, we talk about industrial policy, but look at the subsidies during 1990s. Look at the countries, how much they were using manufacturing subsidy per employee. Netherlands is there. Look at Germany. East Germany was breaking records, basically. But despite all that, records that were broken at the time, the long-term consequences of these things have been very problematic, because the technology and R&D was not prioritized at the time. What was prioritized is to maintain employment, maintain jobs. Yes, that must be attractive for political reasons, but for the long-term health of the economy, there had to be the creative destruction process, the process that the Nobel Prize was awarded for, right? And it was not unleashed at the time. And because of that, look at the R&D spending of the private firms, even today. So the way things are started, it's just there is no sign of technology, innovation, new job, new idea creation. And as a result, these things have long-term consequences. 30 years later, this is the current German economy. Look at the GDP per capita, despite all that industrial policy. This is income per capita. Can you see East Germany and West Germany in this heat map? Very visible. Look at patent per capita, even more visible. Okay? So effectively, some policies can look like, it works well in the short term, but, we have to always look at how it's allocating resources towards firms. Is it allocating, making firms larger because they are more productive, or not, is really the fundamental question here. I would like to switch gears and talk a little bit about organic growth. And when it comes to organic growth, of course, it's not easy, right? It's not easy, and we don't know where the technologies are coming from. But let's try to build step by step. Okay, let's try to build step by step, and see, who might be generating these technologies. So that's why, I think, remember the big model that I showed, initial framework that I showed. I think the talent side is really critical. How we are using our talent is really critical. How do we allocate our talent is really critical, because at the end of the day, productivity will come from technologies will come from individuals. So who is going to produce this technology? Let's try to ask that question. So what I would like to argue is that first, there has to be, of course, engineers and inventors who are ready to provide new technologies, but then there has to be firms or entrepreneurs who are going to hire these engineers and entrepreneurs, right? There has to be a symbiotic relationship between the two. And let's ask the data, basically, who really produces those technologies. So this is a graph that I would like to show you first. This data will come from Denmark, and Denmark is very generous with its own data, and Netherlands is generous too, but in Denmark we know quite a bit, and even the medication that they're using is known, basically. There were some really interesting papers looking at antidepressant use and how risk-taking of the CEOs are, etc. But anyways, so probably you don't need to use medication to take risk. So let's first understand who becomes a scientist in the Danish economy. So on the x-axis we have the IQ deciles. On the y-axis we have the likelihood of becoming an inventor. Okay, inventors who are producing new technologies. The good news is that there's a very tight relationship, and it shouldn't be a surprise, because of course new technology requires creativity, creativity requires talent, and talent proxied by IQ shows this tight relationship. That's great. What about the other side of the equation? What about entrepreneurship, right? We think about technology, but these technologies should be funded by entrepreneurs. So what is the relationship between IQ and entrepreneurs? Let's take a guess. It's strongly negative. Okay, so it's strongly negative. I know you all wanted to see a very tight positive relationship, which I did, when we initially started the research. But, it's very, very strongly negative. Indeed, this is not just Denmark. When you repeat this for Finland and other countries, you just see the same thing. So this graph is trying to tell us something very, very loud and clear, actually. So when we think about entrepreneurship, when we think about using taxpayers' money to subsidize entrepreneurs, this graph says that not all entrepreneurs are the same. And not all entrepreneurs are trying to grow their business. Probably there are a lot of entrepreneurs that started a business just out of necessity because they couldn't find a better job. Of course, they are not going to stay hungry, and then they are going to start a business. Indeed, during COVID, annual business registry numbers in the US is 3.5 million. During COVID, it became 5 million. So where did 1.5 million entrepreneurs come from suddenly? Were they expecting for the, one of the biggest crises that, we have seen, and also when the inflation rate was so high and interest rates were so high, were they waiting for the worst time to start the business? Of course, entrepreneurship is driven by many different things. So that's why just looking at the entrepreneurship numbers is also not informative. We have to also look at their growth performances. Do they hire? Do they, do they also do some productive activities? So, if we ask a deeper question, basically, what explains being an entrepreneur versus being an R&D worker, being an R&D worker or inventor is explained by education and ability. Entrepreneurship is primarily explained by parental status, whether the parents are entrepreneurs or not. By the way, here we are looking at not inheriting a business from parents, but they are starting their own business, basically. So that's why it looks like, the family training played a critical role for parents for becoming an entrepreneur. Now, what I would like to say is the following. Of course, when we think about entrepreneurs, we typically think about Mark Zuckerbergs and Elon Musks, etc. But most of the entrepreneurship is the mom and pop store, the coffee shop owner that you bought your coffee this morning, or the bakery that where you stopped by this morning. They are also entrepreneurs. Then the question is, how can we, for policymaking especially, how can we differentiate between those ambitious entrepreneurs who are trying to grow their business versus who are just born to stay small? The business is born to stay small. What we can do is we can look at whom they're hiring to their firm at a very early stage. I start a new business. I just hire blue-collar workers to carry the boxes around, whereas Marcel, when he starts a new business, he immediately hires a technical person to his company. He is probably a transformative entrepreneur, and I'm probably a subsistence entrepreneur, okay? So let's try to see how subsistence and transformative entrepreneurs will be relating to IQ. Now, the relationship between subsistence and IQ is negative because the majority of the entrepreneurs are like that. 90% is subsistence. Then we look at the transformative, the way I defined, by looking at whom they're hiring at a very early stage. Now it's very positive. Even this split in the data is showing us that indeed there are quite a bit of heterogeneity in the data, and the secret sauce for successful economies is to make sure that these transformative entrepreneurs are able to scale up. And this is the life cycle of businesses that are formed by transformative versus subsistence entrepreneurs. On the x-axis, it's the age of the business. On the y-axis, it has the normalized number of employees that they have in their company. What do we see here? Subsistence entrepreneurs, they start their business first and they just stay flat. They don't grow their business. Whereas transformative entrepreneurs, the businesses that are formed by transformative entrepreneurs, they just keep growing and growing and growing. Okay, so that's why it's clear here that the main dynamism will come from transformative entrepreneurs, and the question is, how can policy unleash these type of people? And of course, an important message, first, if education is so important for being an inventor and being a transformative entrepreneur, who gets educated? This graph is showing the relationship between parental income and the likelihood of getting a college degree. Look at the relationship between family background and the child's education. Even in Denmark, where at least the tuition is not, it's free, there's a very tight relationship because the cost of education is not the direct cost or the tuition. There are indirect costs. Of course, living expenses, the opportunity cost. If somebody is born to a poor family, they need to provide for their family immediately. They cannot, postpone for 4 more years, etc. So one really has to start thinking about, when it comes to using taxpayers' money, education, who gets educated plays a very critical role. And in this study, we looked at the optimal policy. If government had very limited amount of budget, what should the government do? How should the government split the money between subsidizing education, subsidizing innovative startups, or subsidizing incumbents for R&D tax credit, for instance? The analysis says that if you don't have good players, you cannot win the championship. I mean, that's not a problem in Netherlands, but in any activity, you have to have access to good workers. And this analysis shows that when the government has limited budget for policy intervention, first the talent pool needs to be improved. Then when the government has more resources, now we can split the money between training talent and then supporting startups. Then, if we have enough money, enough resources, then we can think about subsidizing incumbents. But in reality, unfortunately, the pecking order is the other way around. Typically, most of the money is given to incumbents, and we have to ask ourselves, why are we subsidizing incumbents? Of course, there can be reasons if there are inefficiencies in the market, if there are spillovers that are not internalized, but we have to have good arguments, ideally good empirical arguments for those type of interventions. So now the question is, should we do more industrial policy? Let's look historically at, before I go to the overall R&D spending, I just want to look at, what do market leaders do? And so here, this graph will come from a study that we conducted on Italian economy. On the x-axis, we have the market rank of a firm. 1 means market leader, 20 means the smallest firm among the largest 20 firms in a market, okay? I'm going to ask the following question. What is the likelihood that a firm hires a politician as they become the market leader? Yes, you guessed it right. So the likelihood of hiring a politician increases substantially. Indeed, this is intensity relative to the size. Are they hiring more politicians because they are becoming more innovative? Let's look at the innovation. Innovation goes the other way around. So when you put the two together, the theory of creative destruction jumps at you, basically. Immediately it shows that indeed market leaders don't have an incentive to push the frontier as much. They have an incentive to defend the turf and make sure that creative destruction doesn't kick them out of the market. And this goes in that direction. So just 2 more minutes. I would like to also show R&D spending in the US. This is the R&D spending relative to GDP by private businesses. It used to be around 0.5%. It went up to 2.5%. It got multiplied 5 times over the years. Especially in recent years, there's an acceleration in terms of R&D spending. So if R&D spending is good, then US economy should grow faster. What happened to growth? Well, productivity growth, labor productivity growth, as you can see, the dashed line is the historical average. In recent years, indeed, after 2004, there hasn't been any acceleration, despite there was an explosion in R&D spending. Okay, so then where do we fail? Normally, the theory says that more R&D should lead to more growth, but that's not what we observe in the data. Indeed, policy has been super active, especially since 1981. 1981 was the first time federal, R&D tax credit was introduced at the federal level. 1982 was Minnesota was the first state to introduce R&D tax credit. Since then, there has been massive support for R&D. And of course, when you give R&D, when you give R&D tax credit, which firms claim R&D tax credit? This is a recent study that we conducted using US Census data. On the x-axis, you have the firm size. On the y-axis, you have the likelihood of claiming R&D tax credit. R&D tax credit, even though it's not designed towards large firms, effectively it's helping large firms. And when large firms are using such policy, of course, what happens is that we are effectively reallocating all the innovative resources towards larger firms. And this graph shows the share of inventors working for large incumbents. When I say large incumbent, those are the firms that have more than 1,000 employees and older than 20 years. What this graph shows is that 48% of inventors used to work for incumbents in 2000. Today, that number went up to 58%. A massive reallocation, thanks to primarily due to those policies. Is this something that we want? Do we want to reallocate resources from smaller firms towards larger firms? Well, if you believe in the theory of creative destruction, probably this is not going in that direction, right? So you're effectively helping the large incumbents to grow even more rather than helping, small and young businesses. So I don't have a problem as long as, large firms remain innovative, okay? And this event study just shows what happens to an inventor when an inventor moves to a large incumbent. You take an inventor who works for a non-incumbent and suddenly the person moves to a large incumbent, changes a job. Now we are reallocating resources towards large firms. What happens to the same individual? Okay, this is the same individual changing a job. When the same inventor moves to a large incumbent, the salary goes up by 12%. You might say, well, because the same inventor is more productive in a large incumbent. The answer is no. The light gray bars show that after moving to a large incumbent, the same inventor becomes 6% less innovative. The individual gets more compensated for less outcome. So clearly, there's large firms, by attracting resources, they are not necessarily becoming more innovative, but they are gaining some competitive advantage by making sure that the rivals don't have the power to compete with the incumbents, right? So as a result, thanks to these policies in the US, we repeatedly see over the past recent decades, market concentration has been increasing. This is the market share of the largest firms. Markups, that shows price over marginal cost, has been going up because the overall competition has been declining in the US. When we look at the firm entry, which is the sign of creative destruction also, new firm creation has been decreasing compared to 13%. Now it's below almost 7%, so almost 50% decline in entry rate and new entrepreneurship. And then finally, when we look at job reallocation rate, remember the accordion that I mentioned, right? Reallocating resources within the room. So those job reallocation rates have been decreasing too. And that's because the beta parameter that I showed in the beginning, right? The beta, the correlation, the responsiveness of the firms, the responsiveness have been decreasing, and these are the results that were generated by Javi and co-authors. That shows that indeed this accordion is getting more and more silent over time, okay? So I think I'm out of time. So overall, there's a lot of work for us to do to understand the sources of productivity slowdown. I don't think it's the same reason that makes all economies slow down. What makes US slower is, I think, is probably different than Europe. What matters is that we have to focus on making sure that firms are dynamic, and those firms that are really dynamic should be able to access resources. But with rigid labor markets or with rigid input markets, that won't be possible. And we need to understand where the frictions are by looking at more and more at the microdata. And then, of course, we should not leave the talent behind. Indeed, I talked about education policy, but the typical approach is looking at the average years of schooling at the country level. I don't think it's the average years of schooling that matters for productivity, or especially innovation-driven growth. It's really the technical training. It's the health of the universities. It's the research workforce that really makes a difference. And I think one final thing I would like to mention is that I was very happy to see the open dialogue that's happening in Netherlands between academic research and policy making, and that's why we are all here. So that's why I think CPB and ministry is doing a great job. These type of dialogues will allow us to bring the MRI results to the table so that we can all put the right diagnosis and come up with the right solution. So thank you very much. Thank you.